Thank you, Roy, and good morning, everyone, here in the amphitheater, and also those of you visiting us via OTN and on your computers. My name is Timothy Murphy. You can call me Tim. Here from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. I've been invited here today to share with you my perspective as one of my mother's caregivers. My siblings and I are presently on a journey with our mother, as together we all navigate the increasingly treacherous waters of my mother's dementia, more specifically, Alzheimer's disease. I am the youngest of 5 children, and even my brothers and sisters will tell you that it's true when I say that I am my mother's favorite. Yeah. My mother was a housewife in the late 1950s. She had 4 children under the age of 5 and a husband with a demanding career as a lawyer and a politician. So she didn't have a lot of time to spend with each child individually until I came along. I was born a full 4 years after my sister Michaela. So I got to stay home with my mother while my siblings were all in school. And my mother doesn't actually love me any more than she does my siblings, but those 4 years I had alone with her did create an undeniably unique bond between us. Let me tell you a little bit about Dorothy Murphy. She was born Dorothy Ann Jenkins in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. She was the youngest of 4, and she herself was the spoiled baby of the family of local jeweler Lloyd Jenkins and his wife Margaret. In high school, my mother adopted the nickname Dot. See, it had always bothered her that people tended to drop the second O in her name, Dorothy, and they'd pronounce it Dorothy. Or even worse, they'd call her Dorothy Ann. She hated that, Dorothy Ann. So, Dot it was. She married my father, Terry, when she was 21, and he was 25 years old and a hotshot up-and-coming lawyer. Interestingly enough, I never heard my father call my mother Dot when he spoke of her. You see, he always put the second O in Dorothy. She loved that. And she loved him, and he loved her. So Dot and Terry raised 5 kids, and she was the perfect mother and the ideal wife. Nobody didn't like Dot Murphy. Smart, funny, beautiful, down-to-earth, talented, and dedicated to her family. She was the ideal politician's wife. When Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister and was Canada's most eligible bachelor, he chose my mother as his first dance partner at the Parliamentary Ball in 1968, which landed her on the front page of the Toronto Star. She still has the dried rose he gave her from his lapel. She was introduced to Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace, and she and my father had a private audience with Pope Paul VI, while my father was the president of the North Atlantic Assembly for NATO. And she was never more comfortable than when she was sitting around a bonfire with her banjo and her auto harp. My father had serious health issues in his later years, and my mom nursed him through a blood clot in his carotid artery, a bout with cancer, which he survived, 2 brain surgeries, cataract surgery, and after making it through all of that, he lost his eyesight to macular degeneration. But my father never complained, and neither did my mother. My father's final battle was with esophageal cancer. He didn't win that one. When he passed away 7 years ago, my mother held us together. She was determined to make my father proud by soldiering on and celebrating what we had, not what we had lost. She set the standard for all of us. My mother continued to live on her own, in their home, and nothing slowed her down. She was 81 years old, still driving, cooking, cleaning, volunteering, making stained glass, gardening, shoveling, socializing, and the only medication my mother took was 1 pill a day for bone density. And then she started repeating herself. Now, it was normal for Mom to occasionally repeat a story because, think about it, she had 5 kids that she was in constant contact with on the telephone. So how are you supposed to remember who you told what to when? But when she started repeating herself in the same conversation, telling the same story over and over again, that was new. And it scared the hell out of me. So, naturally, I didn't bring it up. When it did eventually surface in sibling conversations, I admitted that I had noticed it too. But it was just old age. It happens to everybody, right? Sticky notes. Sticky notes and her day timer. I think those were the next indicators. Reading the sticky notes that were stuck to the kitchen counter to remind her about things that she had to do or remember gave us some insight into the struggle she was having with her memory. And the notations in her day timer started to look frustrated. Things were underlined as if to say, remember this. It didn't take us long to realize that this wasn't just old age. And this didn't happen to everyone. This was different, and we needed an assessment. When her doctor tested my mother's cognitive abilities for the first time, and my mother scored only 1 point higher than the score which calls for a driver's license to be revoked. The doctor recommended that my mother stop driving right then. My mother has great respect for and faith in the medical profession, I think in part due to her upbringing, and partly because she and my father had great friends in the medical profession, and I think certainly because of the experience of being my father's caregiver and the interactions she had with his many doctors. So, fortunately for us, Mom knew she had to trust her doctor, and she handed the keys to her precious RAV over to my sister. Now, I'm not going to lie and say, and that was that, because we were regularly reminded what a pain in the ass it was for her to not be able to drive herself around anymore. Still, despite her resentment over the license situation, my siblings and I discovered something that became very important to us later on. Because the doctor says so is an invaluable tool when advocating that our mother heed advice. Although the first suspicion was that my mother's condition might be vascular, upon further examination, the diagnosis was that she was in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. I am blessed with 3 remarkable sisters who are even more remarkable daughters, and they set about doing their homework on Alzheimer's. My sister Mary Lynn was the one who contacted the Alzheimer's Society. She informed me and my other sister, who lives in Sault Ste. Marie with us, about a learning series offered. It's a 5-week course at the Alzheimer's Society, and we could attend that, and then there were also further educational sessions available for support groups. So we decided immediately that we were going to attend those 5 learning sessions. Because I knew enough about Alzheimer's disease to know that I didn't know enough about Alzheimer's disease. I also knew that I couldn't be in denial about this, and I figured walking through the doors of the Alzheimer's Society would be like an admission of the truth. You see, I played I'm the baby of the family, and I don't deal well with grown-up situations when my father was dying. I'm not proud of that. My sisters were kind, and they excused my behavior and tried to ease my guilt by comforting me with things like, Dad knows you love him. We all deal with things our own way. Not everybody is cut out for work on the front line. So while my other siblings and my mother learned to change my father's feeding tube, I would breeze in and make him smile, cheer him up with the details about my fascinating life, and leave the dirty work to the big kids. But I knew this time I had to step up, because after all, my mother and I have that undeniably unique bond. The learning series at the Alzheimer's Society was life-altering. We got to meet other people who were going through what we were going through, and some who were further along in their journey, and empathy provided strange comfort. We learned about the science of the disease, so it somehow became more tangible to us. We got to hear from people with lived experience who shared their stories live or on video, and they gave us a glimpse into what could be our future. We witnessed the tragedy of Alzheimer's disease, but we also witnessed the wonder of it. When you prepare a caregiver, both intellectually and emotionally like that, when you educate them, when you strategize with them, when you provide them with mental health tools and community resources, you empower them. Every time I left one of those sessions, it seemed like a shadow was being cast off of Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't any prettier in the light, but at least I could see what I was dealing with. Knowledge brings power. I was less afraid and less alone. And I was forming a new bond with my sisters. Meanwhile, my mother had created quite an environment for herself in her own home. She had a routine and she was good at it. She was as self-sufficient as someone who couldn't remember what day it was could be. The sticky notes were beginning to multiply, and were often all bearing the same reminders. She was writing reminders in her daytimer and on her calendar. We had journals that we used to communicate with each other so we would know what had happened on our visits with our mother, and she was now taking those journals and writing in those reminders for herself. We noticed that her hair wasn't always done, that sometimes she would wear the same slacks and blouse for multiple consecutive days, and that she wasn't wearing her earrings anymore. We began to schedule ourselves with at least once daily visits to my mother's house, and my sister Mary Lynn stayed overnight once weekly as well. We made sure Mom was eating 3 meals a day, and we did our best to keep her safe and happy and reassured. But it wasn't long before we recognized that Mom had lost confidence in herself. We could sense her growing anxiety, her frustration, and her fear. We knew we had reached the point where Mom was going to need more supervision than we alone could provide. Once again, my sisters were on top of things when it came to power of attorney and finances and all the legalities that go along with that aspect of being a caregiver. The Alzheimer's Society and CCAC also provided us with information to guide us through the next set of preparations. It was time for more assessments and time for us to investigate our options for either in-home care or, if necessary, consider moving Mom out of her house. Pardon the French, but this shit was getting real. My sisters made appointments to view an assisted living home. I went with them. We loved it. We all agreed that if there were ever any moment of opportunity to introduce the concept of moving into an assisted living apartment into a conversation with our mother, that we would take advantage of that. Funny how those opportunities seldom seem to present themselves. Meanwhile, the 5 siblings became email enthusiasts, and we corresponded and shared information regularly with our brother in British Columbia and our sister in Toronto. We had family meetings and conference calls. We shared our fears and we cried together. We shared our strengths and we laughed together. We shared our decisions, and through it all, we shared love. Love for each other, but most importantly, love for our mother. There were many occasions when we referenced material we had been given about the Alzheimer's Society, or times when we recalled things that we had learned in the 5 sessions. We got our ducks in a row, and we made a list of phone calls to make and questions to ask. And then fate intervened. In October of a year and a half ago, my mother was taken to the hospital with a terrible pain that ran from her foot to her knee. She was in so much pain by the time she got to the hospital that she was crying. My mother does not cry. We've learned so much since that time about dementia. First of all, we learned that when you ask someone with dementia the question, on a scale of 1 to 10, with being no pain at all, and 10 being the worst pain you've ever felt, where is your pain level right now? You might as well ask them, no, I don't know, what day is it? Because chances are you're going to get the answer, Saturday. When you ask it of a very sweet woman who is carrying around 83 years of Catholic guilt and who doesn't want to bother anyone and who has dementia, be prepared for an answer that isn't altogether accurate. So when my mother downplayed her discomfort to the triage nurse took her at her word. And despite my sister having mentioned that my mother had early stages Alzheimer's, she was sent from emergency to the walk-in clinic. where she sat for over 2 hours. And then she was finally sent back to emergency. It ended up that my mother had to have arthroscopic surgery on her knee that night. The initial concern was that she had a blood infection in her leg, but the surgery revealed the problem to be calcium pyrophosphate deposition. It's apparently a type of arthritis formerly known as pseudo-gout. So they thought it was a blood infection, but when the nurse went to draw a fluid from under the kneecap, he said to my mother and my sisters, "Wow, you have a lot of arthritis in this knee." And my sister said, "No, she doesn't have arthritis." My mother said, "I don't have arthritis." I mean, this is a woman who'd been gardening on her knees, walking up and down stairs in her house, never complained, never any symptoms, nothing. And suddenly the nurse said, "I can't even get the needle in to draw fluid because of the crystallization under the kneecap." So she had to have the arthroscopic surgery. Now, my family knew from previous experience that my mother does not react well to painkillers. For instance, it was well known among us that my mother had no tolerance for Tylenol 3. Whenever she'd been given it in the past, it made her wired for sound, and to use my mother's terminology, completely loopy. So, for 3 solid days after her surgery, while receiving post-surgery pain medication of Dilaudid, my mother didn't sleep. She became completely delirious, and we were informed by hospital staff that unless we provided round-the-clock bedside care, my mother would need to be physically restrained to protect herself. So we made sure Mom was never alone. My brother flew in to Sault Ste. Marie from British Columbia. My sister came up from Toronto, and we all took turns doing round-the-clock care so that my mother wouldn't have to be physically restrained. On the 3rd day after her surgery, I was on the morning shift when my mother turned violent. I was alone with her when she became determined to get out of her hospital bed. I was not prepared for her physical strength when I tried to restrain her, and I was literally stunned when she made fists and began punching me in the stomach. Then she slapped me. I was trying to hold her and simultaneously reach the call button, which was on the opposite side of the bed. So I was maneuvering myself around her, and I had my hand across her collarbone, and I was trying to reach for the call button, and the whole time she's punching me in the face. And while this was happening, she managed to get her legs off the edge of the bed, and she got her knee stuck under the guardrail. So I was horrified when the nurses arrived to see them remove a blood-stained blanket from under her. Now, immediately I thought, oh my, she's ripped the catheter out, and who knows what damage she's done. Oh my God, what's happened? Turns out she'd bumped the incision on the guardrail, and the incision was bleeding. It was just a small incision. It wasn't very serious, but it scared the heck out of me when I saw the blood coming out from under her. The nurses terrified my mother, and she became feral. She screamed like a banshee. I had never seen anything like it. Like a board. She flattened out stiff, clenched her fist, and just screamed, blood-curdling. She hadn't slept in 3 days. She was completely delirious. So I tried a new tack while she was having this screaming fit, and I lowered my voice to try to sound authoritative, like my father. I mean, she'd just been talking to him a few minutes earlier. Him and all the other dearly departed that she'd been seeing. So I lowered my voice, and I figured, what the heck, maybe she'd listen to him. And I said, "Dorothy," 2 O's, "Dorothy, we do not hit people." So it worked. She said, "But then don't push me." So she stopped fighting, but her knee was still stuck. So the nurses decided to get her out of the bed and put her in a chair. I told the nurses I had to step outside, because now that she was safe, I needed to release my emotions. I had a meltdown in the hallway, and I called my sister Karen for backup. "Karen, Mom beat me up. Get over here now." Yeah, I wondered how many people who didn't have the support system that our family has ever manage to get through ordeals like this? And that question has been on each of our minds every day since. How do people do it if they don't have the support of siblings, of a spouse, of something? Anyway, after I called my sister, I thought I'd better head back into the room and offer support when I heard my mother shouting at the male nurse, "Get your hands off of me! Who do you think you are?" So I went to the rescue. The nurses, of course, they were so kind, and they did manage to get my mother into the chair, but they were asking her questions that I knew she could not comprehend, and that she was incapable of answering in her current mental and emotional state. They decided to try to administer her pills in applesauce, and the male nurse asked Mom if she wanted to hold the spoon herself. I'm pretty sure she didn't even know what a spoon was at that point. And she wouldn't open her mouth up, clenched shut, so the male nurse gave her the spoon after all, and then he wore the applesauce. I have to admit, I did wonder what sort of training these really terrific, calm and caring nurses had in dealing with patients with dementia. But only for the moment, because then we had to move on to the next. What do we do now? How do we deal with this? I just sort of sat there shaking my head at my wit's end. And that's something else I've learned throughout this adventure, that we're dealing with a series of moments. Our goal is to deal with each moment as they present themselves. I'm telling you right now, if I had not attended those information sessions at the Alzheimer's Society, I don't know how I would have coped with my mother assaulting me and the things that she said to me afterward out of fear and anger and confusion. But I was equipped. And although it came at me fast and furious and way sooner than I ever anticipated, I was able to take it for what it was and not end up completely emotionally devastated. My mother's surgery and subsequent hospital stay led to a more rapid progression of her dementia than any of us were prepared for. Just a side note here, since this time, my sisters and I have discovered that there is a real thing called hospital-induced dementia, and my mother was a victim of that. The medication that she received after her surgery, combined with the circumstances she was in, the unfamiliarity, the lack of sleep, all of those things combined, and it progressed her dementia. Over the course of the next 5 weeks, while my mother bravely fought her way back physically, mentally, and emotionally, she was not returning to her previously semi-independent state. This, suddenly, was a whole new ballgame. Mom going back from the hospital to live in her own house, even with assistance, had become an unrealistic scenario. Even assisted living in that lovely retirement home that we had visited had been taken off the table as an option for our mother's future. We were faced with the harsh reality that our mother needed 24-hour care in a nursing home. The system got trickier to navigate at this point, or maybe it just seemed trickier because we were in the midst of it and we were getting information from so many factions. The doctors and nurses, the physiotherapists, CCAC, discharge staff. Was she going to be moved to the room on the second floor for rehab? Was she going to have to move to a temporary home for convalescent care? Who was assessing what and when, and what did it all mean? For a while, it seemed like every time one of us spent a shift at the hospital, we ended up with a different interpretation of what was being said. Again, we marveled at how other families, without our capacity to band together, to communicate, and to be present with our mother, ever survived this roller coaster ride. We worked very closely with the caregivers and the administrators to keep us ahead of the game as we could. And through it all, we were astounded by our mother's resilience. She remained first and foremost in our minds. Well, we remembered how important self-care is for the caregivers. We made sure we took care of each other too. And when we saw a sibling getting too physically and emotionally drained, we would banish them from the hospital for a day or two and call in the reserves. My sister made a calendar and scheduled friends and family members who had offered to help and take short shifts. We hired Marilyn, a personal support worker with professional experience working in nursing homes and dealing with patients with dementia, to bridge the gaps in scheduling. And her relationship with my mother, which has been going on now for a year and a half, has been nothing short of miraculous. She brought with her experience and wisdom and strategies. At her urging, we fought the natural urge to treat our mother like a sick person in a hospital bed. And we began to bring routine back into her life. Our mother wasn't sick, she was healing. She needed stimulation. She needed activity. She needed music. She needed to get dressed in the morning. She needed her earrings. You see, that was truly a huge part in the decline of my mother's cognitive ability. She had been plucked from her cocoon, her house and property, and from her existence within that environment which she had so carefully crafted as part of her natural survival instinct. Removing her from that safe haven had exposed her vulnerability, and it had exposed our denial about our mother's illness. We put her name on the lists of our top 3 choices of nursing homes and truly accepted the reality that Mom could never live in our parents' home again. During our mother's continued recovery in the hospital, which unfortunately, after the Dilaudid incident and the attack, they decided that she needed something to calm her anxiety, so they prescribed Ativan, a whole other round of the delirium and not sleeping. This is another side note for my sign language interpreter. This wasn't in the script, I'm sorry. My mother's doctor didn't have hospital privileges, and her doctor happened to be in the hospital one day on another matter, and she popped in to pay a visit to my mother. And this is while she was on the Ativan. And the doctor then realized, what has happened? So and honestly, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know what the medication was they ended up giving my mother after that, but whatever it was, my mother slept for about 3 days. And then we began the recovery after that. So once they got rid of those medications that caused her to be so anxious and not sleep and be delirious and be wired for sound, once they found the right medication, she was able to actually begin the process of coming back to us. So we heeded Marilyn's advice over those 5 weeks in the hospital to try our best to return some normalcy to our mother's life with regular routines. I brought in one of the Montessori activity kits from the Alzheimer's Society, and I realized I was still in denial about where my mother was in her state of mental health. See, they had shown me the contents, and they showed me the blankets with the different textures, and the coloring books, and the picture books, and the really easy jigsaw puzzles, and I thought, she isn't at the stage yet where she'll appreciate the textures and colors of a patchwork quilt, and a laptop blanket or a lap blanket, and coloring books of birds. She's way more with it than that, I thought. Those were 2 of her favorite things. The coloring book with the birds, and that quilt with the textures. Along with the jigsaw puzzles, which we are grateful now are far too easy for her. She's up to 500 pieces. Word searches, trivia games, they all contributed to where we are now, which is full-on Scrabble games where my mother does not want to settle for low-scoring words. So she can play Scrabble again, which is amazing to us. My mother was scheduled to leave the hospital for a transitional convalescent stay at a nursing home until a room became available in one of the 3 facilities we had agreed upon as a family for our mother's future residence. We dreaded this move. She was just making progress. She was getting used to the fact that she was in a hospital. To move her again, we thought, oh no, now what? On the same day we heard that a room would be available in 5 days for convalescent care, word arrived that she could move into a private room at Mapleview Nursing Home in 2 days. No convalescent care, straight to her new nursing home. We were thrilled. We had visions of Mom doing physiotherapy in the lovely rehab room on the 4th floor, enjoying the company of others in the dining room, joining in on social activities and benefiting from the comfort afforded with 24-hour care. The reality is that the transition has been heartbreaking, and the simple truth for me and my siblings is that nothing could have fully prepared us emotionally. For the first time, we had to say goodbye to our mother and leave her in a bedroom in a nursing home. No matter how lovely the facility or caring the staff, you just have to live it. But it certainly helps to know that other people live that moment and many other moments like it over and over and over again, and they have survived. I think sharing those personal stories is so important for caregivers. Sharing the tragedies and the triumphs, continuing to cast that light on the shadows of dementia. So my mother has changed. She cries now. She gets angry now. She gets depressed. She's not terrified anymore, but she's always confused. Our family has a new reality. But as we continue on our journey, we were aware that we are creating new memories, and we cling to the moments that remind us that there is still peace to be found in the midst of this whirlwind. I think the hardest part for me is to see my mother struggling to make sense of something that doesn't make any sense. That although my mother doesn't remember what home was, she knows that where she is now isn't home. They told us it would take 3 to 4 months before we could truly assess how our mother has adapted. Well, it's been 1.5 years, and I would say that she's adapted, but of course there are days when she is still extremely unhappy. Marilyn is there 6 days a week, 5 hours a day. We visit as well. There are 3 of us living in Sault Ste. Marie who visit my mother as well. But it's not unusual for me to arrive and find my mother doing her laps, because that's what she does when no one is there. She just walks with her walker around and around and around. And she'll see me and say, "Thank God, somebody I know. Get me out of this place." We've been told, it doesn't take away the lingering doubt, knowing that she's safe, knowing that she's looked after. We know now that we've done the right thing, but for a long time after my mother moved into Mapleview, my sisters and I would visit, and we would leave, and we would sit in our cars, and we would just sit and think, what have we done? Have we done the right thing? Should we have tried to move her back home? Is the nursing home making it worse because she's confused? Of course, that wasn't the case at all. My mother doesn't remember what her houses were. It's funny, she couldn't tell you where she lived or what the house looked like, but she remembers that the card table was stuck behind the furnace in the basement. So she says things like, "Why do I have to stay here? I hate it here. It's like a prison here. I just want to be me again." She knows something isn't right, but she can't figure out what it is. She says, "It's all a fog." She says, "I can see it, it's right there, but I just can't get at it." And then she says things like, "Why did God give me Alzheimer's disease? I never hurt God." And we know that as her caregivers, our role is to listen to her, to comfort her, to alleviate her fears, to make her feel safe, to validate her, and to reassure her that we are here. We're not going anywhere, and she is loved. And for a woman who has dedicated her entire adult life to doing exactly that for her entire family, it isn't that much to ask. Thanks for listening.